This is London. It is with the greatest sorrow that we make the following announcement. It was announced from Sandringham at 10:45 today, February the 6th, 1952, that the King, who retired to rest last night in his usual health, passed peacefully away in his sleep earlier this morning.
That was John Snagg of the BBC, announcing the death of George VI, who you may be more familiar with as Colin Firth in The King's Speech.
His successor was his 26-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. She has reigned as Queen of England and head of the Commonwealth for the last 65 years. She's now 91 years old, and the palace has already begun planning for her death.
Here's Sam Knight, our guest for this week, reading from an article he wrote for The Guardian, where he revealed those plans.
In the plans that exist for the death of the Queen, and there are many versions, held by Buckingham Palace, the government and the BBC, most envisage that she will die after a short illness. Her family and doctors will be there. When the Queen Mother passed away on the afternoon of Easter Saturday in 2002 at the Royal Lodge in Windsor, she had time to telephone friends to say goodbye and to give away some of her horses. In these last hours, the Queen's senior doctor, a gastroenterologist named Professor Hugh Thomas, will be in charge. He will look after his patient, control access to her room, and consider what information should be made public. The bond between sovereign and subjects is a strange and mostly unknowable thing. A nation's life becomes a person's, and then the string must break.
All the way from their Sydney studio, you're listening to the Jolly Swagmen, the podcast on uncommon topics with exceptional guests, with your hosts, Angus and Joe.
Hey there, boys and girls. Welcome to the Jolly Swagmen podcast. I'm Joe.
I'm Angus.
And this week we catch up with New Yorker and Guardian journalist Sam Knight. So we first came across Sam's name back in March when an article he wrote was syndicated to the Australian Guardian. And that article was superbly written, incredibly researched, and it uncovered the secret plans that Buckingham Palace has in place for when Queen Elizabeth II dies. Now, it's worth mentioning that she's lived quite a blessed life in many ways, but quite a weird life as well. And one of the things that happens when you are someone of such historic significance as she is that people plan your funeral, and the palace as well as news outlets in England have literally been rehearsing her death now for years, if not decades.
Yeah, I guess she's kind of been overdue for a while now. Statistically, she could go at any moment, so they've been quite anxious about the response that's going to happen. So before her medical staff, before the family even will know about her passing, her private secretary, Sir Christopher Guyte, is going to be the first man in the world to know that she's actually passed. And then he will then instigate sort of this machinery of state, which will kick into gear to first alert the world to the fact that she's passed away, and then start guiding and driving the process for her funeral. This is everything from notifying Commonwealth governments to sending out a radio alert transmission system, or RATS, which is a long-range wavelength radio signal first developed for the Cold War. So
you sound like you know a lot about radio.
Oh yeah, mate, I'm a certified radio technician. Didn't you know that? I'll have to show you my card. So
apparently, the BBC also have a cheeky nickname for that acronym, RATS. They call it Royal About to Snuff It. Yeah, I learned that in the article.
Very good. Yeah. So you definitely should check out the article. It's on the website. So there is just this elaborate plan. Everything from masking of shiny objects in towns of the herald's trumpets to obit lights which will come on in radio studios, pre-planned soundtracks so there's no upbeat music being played. They've kind of done this down to it, literally to a T.
Yeah, the Times is said to have 11 days of coverage in the barrel and ready to go.
See,
It's pretty
Do you
crazy.
think if you're the Queen, you kind of want to watch that 11 days just to see, what's coming up?
Yeah.
She's not gonna get a
I mean,
chance
could
to
she
look at it.
request an advance of some of the articles?
Surely. She's the Queen.
Yeah.
Do what you want.
Yeah. They also have, so a lot of the news stations, including the BBC, also have historians and royal commentators already contracted to speak on their outlets when the Queen dies.
It's a bit sort of morbid. This nice old lady's going to die, a mother, grandmother, and yet there's going to be, pundits getting on planes going to commentate her funeral.
It's so weird. Yeah. Another thing worth mentioning is that the Queen actually spends 3 months a year at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. So there's a 25% chance that she might die in Scotland. And if that happens, there's a whole other series of plans in order to bring her to London. So firstly, she lies in state at Holyrood House.
So it's like a jurisdictional thing.
Yeah.
So if she dies in Scotland, the Scottish kind of claim her and then give her back. Is that how it works?
Yeah, that's right. Well, they have their own ceremonies first. So she lies in state at Holyrood House. I'll get there. Which is her small palace in Edinburgh.
Tiny palace.
Yeah, very small.
Yeah.
Very small. Very
quaint.
very quaint. Yeah,
Fixer upper.
Yeah, only one room.
Yeah, very nice.
And then they take her coffin up the Royal Mile, where it has a reception at St Giles Cathedral, and then they board her body onto a royal train at Waverley Station before it begins a procession south slowly to London, and the tracks will be lined with onlookers.
Yeah, and to give you a bit of an idea about how long they've been planning this, back when she used to travel overseas, they even had contingencies for the number 32 squadron, the Royal Flight, which would depart London, claim the body, and then bring it back to England for the funeral process. But in every scenario, it seems the Queen ends up in the throne room in Buckingham Palace, which is then where she sits. She lies in state. There'll be an altar, the pall, and the royal standard, and 4 grenadier guards, so the guys with the bearskins. And one thing that I really sort of bumped on in the article is that this was started back when her father passed away. They restarted a tradition called the Princes Vigil, where members of the royal family sort of turn up unannounced and sort of watch over the coffin. This is during the process while she's lying in state. So I thought that was kind of a nice little bit of information that he put in that article.
So when we talk to Sam, we really look at what the consequences and the geopolitical ripples of her death will be. She's a world historic figure. And then towards the end of the chat, we actually talked to Sam about journalism and some of his tips for being a great journalist, interviewing great sources, which is what he did for this article. But the Queen, I guess, it's worth mentioning that although this is a weird and elaborate theatrical rehearsal, at the same time she is a human being.
It's kind of a spectacle in one sense.
Yeah.
But then it's also a grandmother who's passed.
Yeah.
And it's a weird... You don't often go and watch funerals, right? Unless you have to. But everyone's going to be tuning in. It's going to be the biggest show on earth.
Yeah.
So it's kind of... It's
And I wonder whether she's...
It's that weird... you don't want to look, but you're kind of drawn to it.
Yeah. I wonder whether, when people are rehearsing your funeral for decades...
It's a weird thing to think of.
Yeah, are you truly free,
Yeah, it's very...
Has she ever truly been free?
No, she's
a servant of...
She's servant of the monarch and the greater good. I'm
Yeah.
sure that's how she looks at it.
Yeah. What would you take? A privileged life where all your comforts and needs are met, or freedom where they're not guaranteed?
Oh, this is a big question. Can you have it like Prince Harry and just sort of be fourth in line?
Yeah, have both.
In the orbit, but not quite.
Yeah.
But it is timely. This is 20 years since Princess Diana's funeral. There's a lot of talk about that at the moment. And a lot of this is planned on what happened at her funeral as well. So enjoy, take from what you will. It's a bit of a buffet.
And without much further ado, hit it. All right, we're here with Sam Knight, New Yorker and Guardian journalist. Sam, thanks for coming on the pod.
Great pleasure.
Journalism's one of the oldest professions. Are you intimidated by our new media platform?
Yeah, no, I guess you're intimidating because I actually really like the podcast world. It's kind of, I feel like the kind of journalism that I do where I spend ages and ages working on something, it actually sits quite well with podcasts to kind of just chat about the work and how things came together. We do this nice thing at The Guardian where we actually just read out the stories that we've written, and they go out as a podcast as well. And apparently they're kind of almost as popular as people reading them, just because people like to listen to them on the tube and all of that stuff. So no, I'm all for it.
Absolutely. 2017 has been called the year of the pod. You heard it here first. We're boarding the rocket ship here, guys.
So we should probably start from the top and begin with the question of what is London Bridge is down?
Well, London Bridge is down is the code word that will be used to tell people that the Queen has died. And when I say tell people, I guess tell a kind of specific group of people within the British government and media who have been planning for this event for, kind of the best part of 50 years, I suppose, that this event has finally happened. So it's a bureaucratic code word, I guess.
So the very nature of a code word, I guess, is that people aren't supposed to know what it means. Does that mean that you've sort of blown the palace's cover and they now have to come up with a new name?
I tried not to think about that too much, but I think it's possible that they've got a new name, but it's also sort of possible that they've really stuck with it. The plans for various royal funerals were all named after different bridges. So the Queen Mother was Forth Bridge, and the Duke of Edinburgh is Tay Bridge, and presumably there are kind of other bridges named for other kind of senior members of the family, and the Queen has got the big one.
So this year, Queen Elizabeth II turned 91 in April, I believe. And if you asked a statistician or an insurer what that meant to them, it would mean that she probably has about 4 years of life left.
Yes,
so
yeah.
Her passing is imminent. Can you tell us what's happened when some of her predecessors have passed away? For example, George V in 1936.
Yes, it's so funny being a British person, and I don't know how this conveys to growing up in Australia, but you realise that your history of the 20th century, or kind of what you know about your country's recent past, it's just got all these significant dates, you know what I mean? And we don't do it every 10 years or 20 years. There's no regularity to it. When you think back in British history, the dates that jump out are, 1901, death of Queen Victoria, 1910, death of Edward VII. And these things, the 36, the death of George V, 52, the death of George VI, these become the kind of these ructions and these kind of rhythmic kind of moments where you consider where the country has got to, how it's going to evolve next, and you look back and you realize that these are the deaths of our monarchs, and this is how we sort of consider ourselves and renew British society. I don't know. They're these sort of seismic moments, and each one carries a sort of characteristic of its own. So the death of George VI in 1952 and the accession of the Queen was a particularly dramatic and poignant one. You had this guy who was king, who was never really supposed to be king until his brother abdicated. He had this stutter. He was this diffident figure, and yet he had risen to the challenge of the Second World War and representing the nation, and then died relatively young. And then this young, beautiful queen became queen. And so that sort of had this incredible sort of depth of emotion after the Second World War as the country emerged from all of that to the peace and to the future and to prosperity with this kind of young, glamorous figurehead. So 1952, which was the last time this happened, had an enormous kind of narrative power to it. And And I guess that's what you immediately start to think about, what will be the narrative when the Queen dies in the next 5 to 10 years. It's such a weird one. I don't know how she comes across to you guys, but in Britain, everyone sort of treats the Queen like she's sort of, I don't know, in her sort of 60s or 70s. She's always off doing events. She's riding horses. She's got this amazing sort of liveliness, and people talk about her, and I think exists in people's heads as this much younger or potentially sort of ageless person. But if you had a member of your family who was 91, they'd probably, I had a grandpa who was 91. He lived in sheltered housing and had nurses looking after him. Do you know what I mean? That's anyway. So we have a strange sort of disconnect from the reality of how old she is.
It's as if she exists in people's imagination more than reality.
Yeah, and just I guess this is what you do with a king or a queen, but they separate from their mortality, don't they? Because they're a symbol of so many other things, and we're reaching a moment where her mortality is sort of inevitable.
Sam, I've been working on a bit of a theory that she's trying to outlive her son. She just can't sort of contemplate the thought of handing over the throne and having the Duchess of Cambridge as the Queen, but that's a bit of a working theory.
Just sort of hanging grimly on.
She's just determined to outlive Charles.
I mean, kind of good luck to her. I don't know. It was Charles is, it was kind of, this is sort of dorky history stuff, but Edward VII was in exactly the same situation. Victoria just ruled and ruled and ruled and ruled and ruled. She had this son who was just waiting and waiting and waiting, and everyone just thought it was going to be a disaster. He was, unlike Charles, who's this kind of slightly sort of prim, ecological sort of figure. Edward VII was like partying and drinking and having a great time. And everyone thought he was going to be this disastrous king. But then he became king like late in his life, and he just loved it. And he was actually an incredibly popular king. There was sort of feeling of renewing the monarchy and sort of having a good time and bringing the thing in the 20th century. And then he sort of dutifully kind of died 10 years later, and the thing sort of, charged on very happily. So, I know what you mean about the Queen hanging on, but I think, Charles is, well, who knows?
You began your article with a description of the respect that the media will pay in England, and the amazing synchronicity across the media. So from the BBC to, drive time radio channels, people will be, for example, playing solemn music, be taking offensive shows off air. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, what that looks like, how the media is going to react, and how it works, who's coordinating it, or is it just goodwill?
Well, I guess there are kind of two things going on. One is about custom, and it's sort of, unusual in Britain, but we have, at least historically, the dominant role of the BBC as the way of conveying and conducting national occasions, be they sporting or elections or things like royal deaths and ceremonies. And actually, right back to the sort of origins of the BBC in the 1920s, the founders of the BBC realized that it could play this amazing role with regards to the royal family. And you can look back in the history and see, 70, 80 years ago, the BBC sort of pioneered outdoor microphones to be able to pick up the sound of horses' hooves during royal processions and stuff like that. So it's always been really in the DNA of the BBC to bring the kind of nation around the TV set or the radio set for these occasions. So a lot of this, as it is with the royal family itself, is about custom and repeating things. Like we did the last one to this kind of in a huge and sort of deep way. Surely we'll do the next one in the same way. So a lot of this stuff is behavior that's sort of handed down sort of generation to generation almost, and sort of updated with each time. And then, so that's the sort of, I don't know if you like, the sort of sentimental, customary way of doing it. And then there is also planning, and there is a kind of committee coordinated by Buckingham Palace that will meet every sort of 6 months to sort of a couple of times a year, 2 or 3 times a year, depends whether sort of things change, where planning for where the cameras are going to go, which shots there are going to be, which broadcaster will take which position on the lawn in Green Park, where they will erect scaffolding for stands and all of this. There is an incredibly detailed practical plan which is updated every few months with whatever road closures or this building's being taken out of commission for some reason. These things are kind of quietly, actively sort of worked on in great detail. When Diana died in 1997, all the TV guys from the BBC, the ITV, had walked the ceremonial route just 3 weeks before at part of a kind of planning meeting. So actually all of those people knew each other incredibly well. So when something dramatic happens, actually there is a very sort of detailed sort of binder, or sort of, I guess it's a PDF now, full of exactly what you do minute to minute.
You mentioned there that it's gone from a binder to a PDF, and that sort of links into the 2-speed information link that's going to go out when she does pass away. On the one hand, you've got the Foreign Office Global Response Centre and the redundant sort of communication system of RATS, and then you've got the Twitter sphere and social media. But I found it quite interesting that the two redundancies that are built in, the Foreign Office Global Response Centre to reach out to the Commonwealth states, and also RATS. So could you maybe take us through sort of the nature of the Global Response Centre, and then also what RATS is designed for and how it works?
Yeah, so on the Foreign Office side of things, as recently as 10 or 15 years ago, with the death of Princess Diana, that was, she died in a car crash in Paris, and that news was literally, conveyed by the British ambassador in the hospital on his mobile phone, calling the night clerk at the Foreign Office, just some relatively junior civil servant whose job it was to sort of man the phone during the night. And that sort of system had been in place, for 100 years or so. Certainly since then, about 10 years ago, the Foreign Office developed a much more kind of sophisticated thing called the Foreign Office Global Response Centre for dealing with national emergencies, things like the Asian tsunami in 2004 or something like that, to coordinate information among British consulates and embassies around the world. So it's I don't know, it's more of a sort of thing you'd see on Homeland or 24, I guess. And so that will play a key role in kind of sharing information when it happens. And I guess you think about these moments, and I guess the unfortunate parallel is to other big breaking news events, which tend to be, disastrous things. But you're just desperate for real information, aren't you? Do you know what I mean? When something terrible happens, I'm from London. We've had this awful couple of months, and you scratch around between the kind of the chaos of social media and Twitter and something which seems like solid information, and that's where that more old-fashioned infrastructure is going to play its role. Someone during my reporting told me that in Australia, in Government House, and I think also is there a consulate in Tasmania? When the news comes through, the blinds will be lowered to kind of signify that this has happened and that the building is sort of in rest and has sort of gone to sleep. They're not going to do that until they get the call or the email from a very official source.
And how has RATS historically played a role in making sure the correct information is going out and it's sort of in a controlled way?
Well, I get RATS is the BBC equivalent of this, and there's a thing in the UK that, going back to the Cold War, that if you were a submarine at sea and you couldn't pick up BBC long wave radio for 3 days, it meant that the country had been taken out by a nuclear attack, and that was what you fell back on, this kind of very indestructible long wave radio signal. And RATS is a descendant of that. It's supposed to be capable of withstanding major national disasters. So it was a radio triggered signal, so it didn't come through the electricity or the telephone wires or something like that. So RATS is this literally kind of bomb-proof communication system, and you're going to use it when something big and important happens. There's a kind of a question in the last few years whether RATS really still works. When I was doing my reporting, BBC people would say, "Oh yeah, we've got that in the corner of our newsroom, or it's in a cupboard, and it sometimes goes off, and we never know what it's for anymore." There's a sense that these things have been superseded by, mobile phone networks and things being more resilient than they were a generation ago.
Hey Sam, the media have been preparing for years for the Queen's death, but surely that pales in comparison to the actual funeral preparations themselves. Could you give us a sense of the scale and the intricacy of the ritual and the preparation, all the way from D-Day, which is the code name they have for the day that she passes away, through to the day of the funeral itself 9 days later?
Yes, this will be a fundamental kind of national event, and plans are in place from town halls setting up mourning books and kind of lowering their flags, and people wearing sort of black armbands and covering up little sort of town jewels in sort of black bags to make them look all mournful, right through to the stuff that'll be going on in London. It was a kind of, I don't know, it was part of what was exciting about doing this story was realizing that there is part of your country, part of your society, that was working kind of quietly in the background on these amazing details. And one of the things I did to report the story was to go to the National Archives and to look at all the kind of files of sort of previous royal funerals, and these are kind of kept secret for about 60 years. So the details of the last state funeral in 1952 were only released in sort of 2004, 2005, and you can go through them and you can see these incredible discussions between civil servants about what are we going to do about the steps at Windsor, the Memorial Chapel at Windsor Castle. They're very, very steep. Do you think we should do a ramp, or do you think the ramp will get slippery? There's this incredible attention to detail, the colour of the carpets. Should the flags be removed from Westminster Hall? What will we do about the bollards on this particular road? Shall we allow people to sit on this roof? Is it safe? There's incredible patient details, and they sort of either coming from the Parks Authority, as we've sort of referred to, the media, the army, rehearsing how to carry these incredibly heavy lead-lined coffins. There's this sort of unbelievable, almost kind of banal, secret work going on for these events that you never quite know when they're going to happen. But when they happen, they will be the focus of obviously kind of great national attention, but also kind of global attention as well.
Sam, with such detail and intricacy as you've just touched on there, I'm wondering if things have gone wrong in the past. I'm thinking back to the Duke of York's funeral and the funeral of Princess Charlotte.
One of the sort of ironies of this is that Britain used to be rubbish at this. We used to be terrible at it, and it was almost a sort of kind of point of sort of shambolic British pride in the sort of 18th and 19th centuries that we didn't care much. You know what I mean? You'd say, oh, there's the Italians, the French, the Russians, the Germans. They take such pride and they do such perfect displays. But us, we're actually kind of secretly the best, and we almost sort of, because we're the best, we don't really care about ceremony. Ceremony's kind of for sissies. Do you see what I mean? And so you'd have these terrible funerals where there was no heating and people would catch colds and then die. You'd have royal funerals where everyone was drunk. And that really started to change towards the end of the 19th century. So you have what you have is you have this weird thing of Britain declining as a power, but getting better and better at its ceremony, almost to show that we've still got it. Do you see what I mean? And so that sharpening up of British ceremonial pomp and style, which is obviously a kind of huge part of, I guess, the brand of the royal family, is something that was really invented right at the end of the 19th century, when Victoria was nearing the end of her reign and everyone realized we've got to kind of work on our style a bit here, guys. And then obviously sort of during the 20th century, as media became more and more detailed, these things became, they are theatrical expressions.
You mentioned in the article that the magnitude of the Queen's death is one of the reasons it will be so significant is because she ties your country from this magnificent past to the modern era. With an ever agitated or increasingly agitated Scotland, the recent Brexit, and the implications that could have on a reunification of Ireland, is her death going to mark the end of Great Britain?
Look, it's a very, very weird moment for Britain. We have defined ourselves in particular ways for the last, basically since the Second World War. One of the kind of pillars of that identity was being part of the European Union. People didn't love it, but it was an expression of where we sat in the world. And another sort of quiet, unthinking part of the way that we define ourselves has been, is through the monarchy and through the Queen. I mean, one of the things that kind of came up in my reporting was the Queen took the throne in 1952 when Britain still had this enormous empire, and she's still kind of world class. Do you know what I mean? She's a bit like the Pope. Do you know what I mean? The Queen exists in a very small category of global figures. Like, some people think she's the most photographed person in the history of humanity. You know what I mean? She's like the Pope or the Dalai Lama or the President of the United States. You know what I mean? She's part of a very, very small number of truly global figures. And that's not going to be true anymore. Do you know what I mean? That's not true. You compare Churchill to Theresa May. These are radically. The rest of Britain has shrunk, and she has remained
almost stoic.
Stoic, but also enormous. You know what I mean? In people's minds and in people's imaginations, and it's very, very hard to imagine the country replicating that in its next monarch. And as you refer to Brexit, there's sort of Scotland kind of unsure of whether it still wants to be part of this. It's hard, and it was a real reason for doing the article was just this idea of the UK kind of rocking at the moment and thinking about how to define itself in the future, and realizing well, shit, now the Queen's going to die. So that was a big reason for doing the article.
In Australia, our current PM and former chair of the Australian Republican movement, Malcolm Turnbull, is quite fond of saying that there are more Elizabethans than monarchists in Australia. And by that he means that most Australians would prefer a republic, but not until after the Queen dies. And it's probably true that the Australian Republican movement is ready to ratchet up its campaigning at a respectful time after her death. That's a local example for us down under, but what are the broader implications for the Commonwealth system when the Queen dies?
Well, the Commonwealth is an amazing example of something that has sort of arisen during the reign of Queen Elizabeth to kind of deal with a specific set of circumstances that will now be sort of re-examined, when she dies. So the Commonwealth came about to basically make room for India, like when in when India became independent in 1947, it was a republic, whereas all the other kind of countries in the Commonwealth, in the empire, weren't republics, and the Queen was their head of state. And India wouldn't accept the Queen as a head of state. So the Commonwealth was invented as a kind of new category for countries. And that has then grown over the last 50 years. I think there are now 36 republics in the Commonwealth that accept the Queen as the head of the Commonwealth, but not as their head of state. It's this fictional arrangement which has been created to allow her to be a figurehead. But when you start poking at it, what is the nature of that relationship? And there's no system within the Commonwealth to choose a successor. There's no, what is, you guys can tell me as Australian, what is the nature of Charles's authority over the Australian people? I mean, it's a mad, abstract idea when you kind of examine it with any sort of rational sort of scrutiny. And so part of the job of what the British monarchy is kind of amazing doing at these moments is in the moment of a death and one monarch being succeeded by another, you sort of tie everyone in again. Do you know what I mean? You kind of bind everyone in again to this enterprise and this good idea. And that's always been fairly straightforward in the past. But it seems to me like very, very difficult to make a really good, solid argument for why Charles should be a head of state in a country thousands of miles away with a lot of its own stuff going on.
Well, we actually wanted to turn to that now. So, as loyal subjects of the Crown down here in Australia, what can we expect life to be like under King Chuck, or the Big C, as he's commonly referred to down here? Will his
and how he likes to be called himself, to be fair. Yeah.
So I've heard. The Queen is dead, long live the King. What will the changes in style or priority be like under the Big C?
This is, I don't know, this is, everyone's got their idea of Charles. I mean, I spoke to some of his advisors while I was doing this article, and one of the points that one of them made to me was that Charles, he's not an idiot, right? Do you know what I mean? He's been waiting to do this his whole life. He's obviously thought about what kind of a king he's going to be. And the analogy that this kind of advisor gave to me is that sort of forget the figure of Prince Charles. And the analogy he used to me was there's a difference between a barrister or a solicitor in a court making an argument and pushing stuff that he feels strongly about and sort of being a little bit of a sort of hectoring figure with his own views about stuff. Think of that barrister then becoming a judge. And so going from being a prince with his interests to being more of a kind of quiet, symbolic figure who listens and sort of occasionally, much like the Queen does. Do you see what I mean? That sort of point made by Charles's people was, there's a difference between being a prince and being a king. The other sort of, I guess, more sort of fun take on it is, look, the guy's been waiting for so long, he might not have that long to be king. Surely he's going to kind of use it to do some stuff. And that's when I think it all gets a little bit Big C.
Don't go anywhere, guys and girls. We've got plenty more great pod coming up. Now, a word from our sponsors.
The Jolly Swagmen podcast is proudly sponsored by Globite. Since 1911, they have been providing tremendous travel products to needy adventurers and tired sailors.
Do you like wanderlust? Do you like taking Instagram selfies with your friends travelling around Europe? Well, how are you going to look fresh for those photos unless you've used Globite's memory foam neck pillows, you dinguses?
And how are you going to charge those phones to take the selfies if you don't have a travel adapter?
Think about it.
Head to www.globite.com.au and enter the discount code SWAGMAN for 15% off all products.
This is how we've survived on our flights back from Melbourne. It is worth it. 15% off as well. That's not to be overlooked.
Globite, you go, we go.
And we're back with Sam Knight, New Yorker and Guardian journalist, and our royal expert here on the Jolly Swagmen podcast. Sam, can you tell us the story of writing your article on London Bridges Down?
Yeah, so it came about every few months. A few editors and writers at the Guardian, we go to the pub and sort of chat about things, much like we're doing now. And it was just after Trump had been elected in the US, and we'd continue to have this sort of traumatic time in the UK over Brexit, which was this decision which happened last summer. So we were just sort of feeling rattled at the end of 2016, and someone said, well, what's going to happen next? And someone sort of rather unthinkingly replied, well, next thing's happen is the Queen's going to die. And we all sort of looked at each other and were like, Christ, we're not ready for that. We can't take it. And we began to talk about the ramifications it might have. And so I began to look into writing this article. And it was kind of inspired a bit by an article in the New Yorker last October, I think, called "What Will President Trump's First Term Look Like?" And it was before Trump was elected, and it was still an unthinkable thing. But it was a very detailed, sort of speculative reporting about what might actually come to pass. And I began to think about trying to do the same thing for the Queen. And I guess I had this thought early on that while the rest of us kind of live in 2017, the monarchy depends on precedent and sort of building on events in the past. So I kind of had a thought that whatever happens with the Queen will be based, very clearly on things that have happened before. And the amazing thing is that because she's been Queen for so long, we haven't actually had this occasion, this version, this scale of royal funeral and accession since 1952. And so I went back in the archives and I started reading and looking at all this sort of amazing planning and correspondence and used that as the basis of my reporting to then approach people involved in the plans to see if I could kind of winkle more information out of them.
Sam, while we've got you here, we have to ask you this, but the lifeblood of our show at the Jolly Swagmen is persuading people to talk to us who don't necessarily want to, and we may or may not include you in that category. But how do you get your sources to talk? What would be your top one or two pieces of advice there?
So I think one of the things that I find in most stories that I do is that there's kind of a language for that story. So you might be writing about, plans for the Queen's death, or you might be writing about, did an article a couple of years ago about Ronnie O'Sullivan, who's a sort of big deal snooker player in the UK, and to start having good conversations with people, you need to show that you can speak the language. Do you know what I mean? So it was very important for this article that I'd spent that time in the archives and read the books, and so as soon as you start talking to people, you can ask them really, really dorky questions, like, what about the false lid for the coffin, guys? Are we going to have that? And people realize that you're coming from you're doing an honest job of research. And they kind of can't help themselves, but by trying to help you. It's strange being a journalist. I don't know how this works with you guys, but people do their work, but when do they get to have a really detailed, sympathetic conversation about it? Do you know what I mean? Are they going to bore their partners or their children about this stuff? I think when people encounter a journalist or a writer or some kind of maker of TV or radio, if they encounter someone who's really genuinely kind of interested in doing kind of hard work on it, there's a human instinct to respond to that. It's either that or just pay them. Just pay them as much.
Well, we've sort of found that laid back Aussie charm gets you most of the way, and then a cheeky smile at the end caps it off.
But we are open to paying people.
Yeah. Not me all.
Checks in the mail. Sam, your articles, whether about Nigel Farage or the Queen of England, combine impeccable research, great subject matter, and consistent style. And you just seem to churn out these great articles time and time again. Do you have a formula for a great piece?
And what is it? Give us the formula.
I feel like you're working your flattery on me here. Is there a formula? Look, there's no formula. I think of things that are like useful to have in your head are I guess when someone asks you when you're working on something, I kind of always take those conversations quite seriously. I sort of dodge a lot of them. But if you're going for it, then you use those conversations to try and land upon the most inviting way of talking about a subject. Do you see what I mean? So if someone says, "What are you working on?" and I say, "Oh, I'm writing a thing about Nigel Farage and how he became friends with Donald Trump," that's like an anecdote, right? And you want it to be the best anecdote that it can be. So I don't know if this is going to sound like a terrible thing to say, but you know how you've got your stories that you tell people, and this is a good one. I'm going to use this one. You work on it, you refine it. You realize where the punchlines are. Which bit of backstory have I got to fill in first? Otherwise, that bit's not really going to land. Do you know what I mean? Like I do think of these articles as anecdotes. Do you know what I mean? As kind of as stories with a payoff. And I guess when I'm working on that, that informs my thinking about how you report them, because you want to think in terms of scenes. You want to think in terms of, even though I write, it's helpful to think about these things visually, particularly with the Queen article. In my head all the time was, well, how are we going to be receiving this information? We're going to be watching it on TV. We're going to be looking at little, they're not called vines anymore. What are they called? They're like little clips on Twitter, on Facebook. We're going to be seeing these in sort of fragments of images, and what are those going to be? And if you try and gather information in that way, you can then write about it in that way afterwards. Anyway, short answer to your question: scenes. What's it going to look like? What did it look like? You ask Farage. I don't know what he was wearing. Was he feeling hungover? You try and make the thing as vivid as you can.
Do you feel like your intuitive sense for what the interesting questions are has got better and better over the years?
No. I'm a very, very inefficient questioner. Like these aren't. I don't ask people perfect little questions that they're like, I've never been asked that before, and it suddenly kind of opens a kind of river of information.
Yeah, like a skeleton key of a question.
Yeah. I just bumble around. Sort of long, interminable questions. Often people say, "Sorry, what was the question?" And then, sort of out of a kind of guilt, they just start talking. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And what do you say to people who would argue that long-form journalism of the type you practice is sort of nothing more than retrospectively imposing a narrative on past events that are just too complicated or opaque to be accurately retold?
Oh, well, I'd say that sounds like a nice life that you're living. I mean, don't we do that? That sounds really nice. Oh, yes, life is just a kind of chaotic miasma and there's no point trying to tell stories about it. I mean, fuck off. Like, what do? We tell stories all the time. What did you do today? Oh, I did this, that. Information rises to the surface. You tell people about interesting characters that you came across. Like, this is how we function as people, isn't it? To tell stories. Like, long-form journalism is a particularly niche, sort of weird enterprise. You can feel quite mad doing it, but you can also feel incredibly sort of lucky and privileged because it's not as if there's like a shortage of stuff going on in the world at the moment, is there? So I don't know. And I guess on a more sort of serious tone, the internet and kind of the future of journalism is sort of revealing, I think, I hope, I cross my fingers and pray, like these interesting little crevices where things are able to happen. I don't think anyone really foresaw that long-form journalism would be sort of experiencing fairly healthy times at the moment. And that's because of this weird thing of people, like, they come out quite well on the iPhone. Do you know what I mean? Like, who knew that? Who knew that people would be on the underground just like flicking on their iPhone and reading a story for 20 minutes on the way to work, or we could read them out as podcasts and listen to them. I don't know, but it seems impossible for me that anyone could predict the way that these things can get kind of packaged up and presented to people. Like, the internet was supposed to just annihilate all our attention spans, and it's largely worked, and we're all sort of hideously addicted to the sort of dopamine hits of emails and Twitter and all of that shit. But it's also created all these opportunities for us to experience storytelling.
You're right about how the internet's facilitated long-form journalism as well. I mean, we've seen platforms like Medium arise almost as a reaction to things like Twitter.
Yeah.
Sam, lastly, before we move on to our final five, how will you feel the day Queen Elizabeth II dies?
Well, I'll have a kind of inescapable kind of professional reaction, which will be, I really, really hope that my article was correct. It's going to be like, but I think personally, I think doing this article revealed to me that at the heart of this kind of rather sort of old-fashioned and reserved and sort of staid country that I've lived in for pretty much all of my life, there is this completely bonkers theatrical device which helps define us as the people that we are. There are these men in cocked hats and trumpets, and this thing is incredibly important. And it's also this like willing pantomime that we all take part in as our way of defining ourselves. And it's just, it's exactly the same as like an indigenous tribe in the Amazon having some sort of set of rituals for defining who they are and how they interact with one another. We have this absurd fiction that there is a family that stands for us, and we kind of love it too. So I don't know. So I think when it happens, I think I'll probably have a sort of mixture of sort of professional admiration for the people pulling this off, and I will be sucked into it myself. Because if you try and stand apart from it completely, then that's quite a frightening idea, isn't it? There's this sort of theatrical thing kind of taking place, but you're not going to go to the theatre. You're going to kind of glumly sit it out. I don't know. It'll be really weird.
I think everyone around the world, and particularly in Australia, whether you're a fan of the monarch or you're pushing for a republic, will probably share that sentiment and just be drawn into the, as you said, theatrics of, what is just, another elderly lady who's passed away.
But in what will be one of the biggest shows we've ever seen.
And there is also this sense of her as a person. Not that any of us know her in any meaningful way at all. She's, do you know what I mean? This person has lived this incredibly sort of exposed life of sort of service and symbolism. But who was she? The kind of, she will be this rather mysterious figure, even though she's so familiar at the same time.
It's now time to turn to what is probably the best part of any podcast that we do, and that is the final five. So these are quickfire questions. Speak from the heart and strap yourself in.
Okay.
Sam, what's the one thing that you hold to be true that most of society doesn't agree with you on?
I think sort of cheese and sort of savouries are sort of perfectly good kind of breakfast foods.
Is that right?
Am I? Has that gone down? Am I? Is that just obvious? Does everyone feel that way, or am I? Or
There
am I
is
slightly
some
out
serious nodding going on in the room, I can tell you.
That's very French of you.
there? Yeah, maybe it is quite French of me.
Yeah. Well, I suppose that leads quite naturally into our next question. What's the first thing you do in the morning and the last thing you do at night?
Well, I have 2 young daughters, and they sort of have sort of fairly sort of boisterous role in whatever I'm doing first thing in the morning. I try and make my wife a cup of tea. Tries to be the first thing I do, but I'm sort of often dealing with some sort of disaster. And then last thing, and I do always try and read a few pages of a novel, just because that's sort of where it's happening, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Fiction or non-fiction?
Fiction.
Yeah, good way to go to sleep. You don't want to switch on the analytical part of your mind before you go to bed.
No. It's always it's a very nice sort of quiet kind of ritual to kind of completely get into a story.
Sam, next question. Are you a hunter or a gatherer?
I did think about this one, and I think I am a gatherer. I think I'm a sort of sly gatherer.
Shout out to all the gatherers.
Yeah.
And
how does that break down? What are most people? Most people hunters or gatherers?
Most people say hunters, but
recently we've had a run of gatherers.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you know it?
Yeah.
What makes you a gatherer?
Well, just sort of ferreting around the place. Do you know what I mean? Just sort of
just
gathering up,
walking around the house, turning things over,
bring up little bits and bobs. I mean, I might be hunting very, very small things.
Yeah.
Morsels of knowledge, maybe.
Say that again.
Hunting morsels of knowledge.
Morsels. I thought you said moss. Yeah, I'm hunting moss. Yeah. It's gathering all the way, isn't it?
It is. That's right. That's what we say. Sam, what is the last lie you told?
The last lie I told. I mean, I'm presumably sort of lying to myself about this, but I feel like I don't know. I feel like I'm sort of telling, benevolent lies quite often. It's this interaction between journalists and people is like a very vexed situation. Most people are incredibly suspicious of the media, and rightly so, and think it's this sort of beast with sort of inclinations and sort of appetites of its own. And I find myself just often reassuring people that it's not all like that. And I am trying to do a good job. And I don't feel like that's a lie, but I feel like I have to suspend people's suspicion and kind of fear quite a lot. And it's not lying, but it's like, it's I don't know, it's like, they're strange conversations when you're trying to kind of reassure people that risks don't exist, and the risks kind of do exist, but you're gonna try and mitigate those risks or kind of deal with them. But this is a long tangled question. The last lie I probably told to my 3-year-old daughter about 20 minutes ago about how I was going to give her an ice cream or something like that. Yeah.
Terrific. Final question, and probably the trickiest of your career. Are you glad that you agreed to this podcast?
Yeah, very good. I am. Yeah, I'm getting into it. I feel like we loosened up a bit.
Was that one of those white lies?
Well, this is what I mean about language. No, I'm feeling better and better about having taken part in this podcast. now that it is coming to an end.
Well, look, Sam, we've really enjoyed it as well. As I mentioned, we absolutely adore your articles. We'll have a link to London Bridges Down in the show notes. Just finally, where can people find you?
I think Twitter's not bad. I'm on Twitter as Sam Knight Writes.
Sam Knight Writes. Great.
Fantastic. Well, Sam, thank you for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we look forward to your next story.
Good. I'll get on with it.
Terrific. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, guys.
From the Great Hall in the Palace of Westminster, they bear George VI as the hour sounds for his last journey. In 3 days, 300,000 of his people have made their pilgrimage. Now Britain buries her king, and the nations come to pay their homage. On his coffin are the emblems of majesty, the crown, the cross-mounted orb, symbol of Christianity over the world, and the scepter, ensign of kingly power and justice. And with them, his wife's wreath of lilies of the valley and orchids. Tragic in somber black, the ladies of his house follow, the Queen Mother, and Princess Margaret, together in their grief. Out of Palace Yard, for the last time, passes George VI, whom history will name the Good. The sovereign-to-be is proclaimed by Garter, King-at-Arms.
Whereas it hath pleased Almighty God to call to his mercy our late sovereign lord, King George VI of blessed and glorious memory, by whose decease the crown is solely and rightfully come to the high and mighty Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary. We, therefore, the lords spiritual and temporal of this realm, being here assisted with these of His late Majesty's Privy Council, with representatives of other members of the Commonwealth, with other principal gentlemen of quality, with the Lord Mayor, Aldermen, and citizens of London, do now hereby, with one voice and consent of tongue and heart, publish and proclaim that the high and mighty Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary is now, by the death of our late sovereign of happy memory, become Queen Elizabeth II.
God save the Queen.
Thanks for listening, everyone. If you like what we're doing, be sure to rate us on iTunes and leave a review. And also head to our website, thejollyswagmen.com, for links to everything discussed in the show, including Sam's original article in The Guardian.
And full disclosure to everyone, Joe and I are heading down to sunny Melbourne next weekend to go to the Australian Republican Movement's gala dinner. Promises to be a great event, and we're also flying Tiger Air. So if you don't hear us next week, there's been a problem.
Thanks, guys.
See ya.